condemned by the royal family for his taboo devotion to a notorious male prostitute, he was nevertheless revered by millions and given a grand state funeral as a savior of the conservatives. He was King Paul I of Greece. How could a man live his entire life as a hollow shadow, sacrificing his true love to protect the fragile illusion of a dynasty? Born in Athens in 1901, King Paul I's early life was built on an inherently unstable foundation. He was the third son of King Constantine I and Princess Sophia of Prussia. Blood of Europe's greatest dynasties flowed in his veins. Through his mother, he was the grandson of German Emperor Frederick III and the great-grandson of Queen Victoria of England. He had close ties to the British royal family, eventually becoming a close cousin of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. In the public eye, this lineage guaranteed a life of privilege and unwavering duty. However, the Greek monarchy was inherently fragile. It is often described by historians as a republic with a crown. The throne was constantly threatened by political upheaval, military coups, and deep national divisions. During World War I, the schism tore the country apart. King Constantine I was forced into exile in 1917. The young Prince Paul, then only a teenager, was thrust into a nomadic life. He lived in Switzerland and later in London. He was a prince without a stable kingdom. He was trained to join the Navy and educated to obey orders. He was expected to project strength. However, constant upheaval left a deep mark on his psyche. He grew up understanding that kingship was a precarious spectacle, a mask worn to survive. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Greek royal family was once again in exile. Paul found himself out of place in Western European high society. He was a handsome, titled nobleman with little practical responsibility. He appeared gentle and quiet. He was well liked but lacked the fierce ambition of his brothers. London and Paris in the interwar period were cities of contradictions. They were places where the strict rules of the upper class coexisted with a thriving, secretive underworld. It was in this murky world of artists, writers, and exiled nobles that the carefully constructed royal facade Paul had built began to crumble. And it was here that he met the man who would shape the hidden truth about his life. His name was Denny Fouts. He wasn't born into royalty. He was the son of a broom maker in Florida, USA. However, Denny possessed a power comparable to that of any king. He was blessed with almost superhuman, timeless physical beauty. Furthermore, he had a mysterious, captivating allure. He understood the hidden desires of the upper class. The famous American writer Truman Capote later described Denny as the most secretive man in the world. Other great writers of his time, such as Gore Vidal and Christopher Isherwood, were equally fascinated by him. Denny was a high-class playboy. He was the professional companion of the wealthy. He moved effortlessly through the luxurious hotels and secret salons of Europe. He offered an escape from the oppressive expectations of the elite. When Prince Paul met Denny Fouts, the attraction between them was immediate and intense. It wasn't just a fleeting physical encounter. It was the collision of two lost souls. Paul found in Denny a complete abandonment of the rigid, suffocating royal institution. Denny didn't care about Paul's title. He didn't care about the precarious Greek throne. He offered Paul absolute, pure freedom. They began a deep, intense homosexual relationship that defied all expectations placed upon the prince. They traveled together throughout Europe. They spent time in Paris, London, and the remote island of Capri. They lived a nomadic lifestyle, completely separate from the watchful eyes of the royal family. For the first time in his life, Paul didn't have to act. He could simply be a man in love. But that freedom was laced with poison. Denny Fouts was a deeply wounded man. He was a heavy drug addict, though otherwise perfectly functional. He relied heavily on opium and later heroin to numb the demons within him. Denny's alluring charm drew the vulnerable prince into a dark, self-destructive underworld. Numerous historical sources and literary memoirs from that era reveal that the future king of Greece and the American male prostitute spent countless nights in secret opium dens in Paris and London. They immersed themselves in the thick, sweet smoke. They escaped the world. They temporarily abandoned reality. Drug use became a shared ritual. It deepened their interdependence. They were completely isolated in that shared obsession. Their relationship became so close that they wanted to be together for life. The nobility demanded formal marriages, sealed with gold rings and public vows. Paul and Denny chose a different kind of covenant. According to persistent rumors in European high society, and as recorded by some contemporaries, these two men made a secret pact. Many historical sources and literary memoirs suggest they tattooed identical symbols on their chests. Some documents describe it as a small blue tattoo. If true, it was the physical mark of a secret rebellion, etched into the very skin of a future king. It was a hidden symbol of a life he was forced to give up. However, the illusion of escape could not last. The geopolitical landscape of Europe was becoming increasingly bleak. By the mid-1930s, the balance of power in Greece had shifted once again. The monarchy was restored. Paul's brother, George II, returned to the throne. Since George had no children, Paul was suddenly elevated to the position of crown prince. He was the direct heir to the kingdom. The watchful eyes of the ruling class were fixed on him. This European royal network, heavily influenced by the British monarchy, needed stability in the Mediterranean. They viewed Paul's extravagant lifestyle as a grave danger. Rumors about his frequent American boyfriends and his involvement in the underground drug trade reached the palaces. The family decided that this wandering prince had to be subdued. The pressure on Paul was immense and relentless. He faced a harsh ultimatum. He had to choose between his duty to the royal lineage and the man he loved. The Greek throne, backed by British political forces, could not tolerate a scandal. They demanded that Paul immediately sever all ties with Denny Fouts. Furthermore, they demanded a public demonstration of his obedience. They demanded a royal marriage. Paul, a man trained from birth to serve the institution, finally succumbed to the weight of his legacy. He made the painful decision to abandon Denny. The separation was devastating. The American was pushed out of the royal orbit, left adrift alone on a continent rapidly descending into war. Meanwhile, Paul was handed over to those who would forge his new life. The woman chosen to help the prince restore his reputation was Princess Frederica of Hanover. She was the granddaughter of the former German Emperor Wilhelm II. Frederica was quite different from Paul. She was ambitious, sharp-witted, and unwavering. Ultimately, she earned the nickname Iron Queen. Historical records clearly show that Frederica was not a naive bride. She was acutely aware of the complex realities of European royalty. Given the secretive nature of royal gossip, it's highly likely she knew about Paul's past. She knew about the Americans. She probably also knew about drugs. She didn't marry Paul for a fairy tale romance. She married him for power. She understood that Paul was a wounded prince, easily manipulated, and in need of a strong manager. Their wedding took place in January 1938 in Athens. It was a grand, magnificent event. It was designed to showcase absolute stability and traditional values. The British ruling class wholeheartedly approved of the marriage. To the public, it was a moment of national pride. They saw a handsome prince impeccably dressed in military uniform and a radiant, energetic bride. They saw the promise of a secure future. They did not see the profound emptiness in the groom's eyes. They did not know that beneath his impeccably tailored naval uniform, hidden from the cheering crowd, was a small blue tattoo. The marriage was a masterful public relations maneuver by the dynasty. It was the beginning of a lifelong campaign to erase the truth. From the moment they exchanged vows, Paul's life no longer belonged to him. Frederica took complete control of his public image. She gradually dismantled the wandering prince persona, replacing it with that of a devoted husband, a stern military figure, and a devout patriot. When World War II broke out and the royal family was once again forced into exile, retreating to Egypt and South Africa, it was Frederica who drew attention. She relentlessly organized relief efforts and managed crucial political relations with the Allied forces. Paul willingly embraced his own subjugation, finding a strange solace in relinquishing his autonomy. He allowed Frederica to become the absolute architect of his life, living behind the impenetrable wall she had built around him. The man who once wandered across Europe in search of true freedom is now a prisoner of his own crown, haunted by the ghost of a love he was forced to abandon. The transition from a life of unrestrained freedom and passion to a rigid, structured life of duty deeply wounded the prince's spirit. He donned military uniform, attended state banquets, and smiled for carefully controlled press photographs. Yet, the silence necessary to maintain this life was suffocating. The royal family had succeeded in neutralizing the threat to their reputation. They had protected the royal lineage, but in doing so, they had transformed a living, breathing human being into a mere symbol. As the flames of World War II began to reshape the world order, Paul prepared to inherit a shattered nation. He would do so not as his true self, but as a perfect, empty creation of the Iron Queen. The true price of this royal deception and the tragic ultimate fate of the man left in the shadows has yet to be fully realized. The flames of World War II created the perfect environment for Queen Frederica to consolidate her absolute power. When the Nazi war machine advanced into Greece in April 1941, the royal family was forced to retreat in humiliation and peril. They first fled to the island of Crete, enduring relentless bombing, before escaping to Egypt and finally finding refuge in South Africa. For many monarchs, exile is a period of utter helplessness, but for Frederica, it was an unprecedented opportunity. Escaping the traditional male-dominated structure of the Athens court, she stepped directly into the political vacuum. She became the de facto leader of the exiled Greek ruling class. Conversely, Paul retreated further into the shadows. He was a well-trained naval officer, a man of physical courage, but completely lacking the ruthless political instincts necessary to govern a world engulfed in war. On the vast estates of Cape Town, under the protection of South African Prime Minister John Smuts, Their marriage was firmly established and unchangeable. Frederica chaired the meetings. Frederica wrote correspondence to Winston Churchill and the British High Command. Frederica drafted public address programs to encourage the occupied Greek people. Paul stood beside her in his impeccably tailored military uniform, exuding an air of solemnity, composure, and dignity. He was the outward face of the family, but she was the driving force. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a tacit bilateral agreement. Paul had abandoned his inner life the day he left Denny Fouts. Giving up political power was simply the logical next step. He found a profound, paralyzing security in his wife's relentless capacity. He didn't have to make painful choices. He didn't have to reveal his own insecurities. He simply had to play the role she had meticulously orchestrated for him. They presented to the world the perfect image of a unified heterosexual and familial marriage. They had 3 children, Sophia, Constantine, and Irene, providing ultimate proof of their commitment to the royal lineage. The British authorities, desperate for reliable allies in an unstable region, viewed the couple with immense favor. They saw exactly what Frederica wanted them to see, a reliable future king, governed by an excellent, pragmatic wife. However, the human heart cannot be completely cleansed by politics. While Paul performed his duties mechanically, physical evidence of his past still weighed silently on his chest. The small blue tattoo, inked in the haze of Parisian opium smoke, was a silent, permanent rebellion. Each morning, as he fastened the brass buttons on his uniform, he sealed that rebellion from the world. It was his only remaining truth and his most dangerous secret. He was a man torn apart. Publicly, Paul belonged entirely to Frederica and the geopolitical machinery of the British Empire. Privately, Paul, buried under layers of duty and repression, remained inextricably linked to a dying American male prostitute. While the royal family lived relatively comfortably after the war, meticulously planning their return to power, Denny Fouts was plunged into a spiral of solitude, squalor, and oblivion. The outbreak of global war had completely destroyed the upper class and the extravagant lifestyle of interwar Europe. The wealthy patrons who had once vied for Denny's attention had either fled to America or retreated to their fortified estates. Denny was left alone. He was no longer the world's most prized toy. He was an aging addict trapped in a continent tearing itself apart. He wandered from Paris to Rome, his once sublime beauty beginning to wither under the relentless onslaught of heroin and poverty. The stark contrast between the 2 former lovers was the most scathing indictment of the royal apparatus. The system had identified Paul as a protected asset and Denny as a seed to be eliminated. The system worked perfectly. Paul was protected by his wife's wealth, status, and powerful geopolitical shield. Denny was abandoned, tossed into the jaws of history. When prominent writers of the time occasionally encountered Denny during the war years, they were horrified by his physical decay. He was described as a ghost, an empty shell of the magnificent man who had once captivated a prince. He survived by clinging to the fading values of the past, a tragic relic of a world that no longer existed. Denny knew exactly why he had been abandoned. He understood the ruthless calculations of the monarchy. He bore the full cost of their shared guilt, while Paul was honed and prepared for the throne. In September 1946, a controversial referendum restored the monarchy in Greece. The royal family returned to Athens, but they returned to a country engulfed in bloodshed. The German occupation had seamlessly transitioned into a brutal and destructive civil war. Communist fighters, battle-hardened and heavily armed, waged a fierce guerrilla campaign against the royal government. The country was starving, divided, and on the brink of complete collapse. It was in this hellish situation that Paul was swept up when his childless brother, King George II, died suddenly of a heart attack in April 1947. At age 45, the wandering prince officially became King Paul I of Greece. This moment couldn't have been more crucial. Western powers, particularly the United States, now burdened by the strategic weight of a financially exhausted Britain, viewed Greece as a vital front line in the burgeoning Cold War. The Truman Doctrine had poured millions of dollars and thousands of military advisors into Athens. They demanded strong, decisive, anti-communist leadership. They demanded a warrior king. What they got was Frederica. From the moment Paul ascended the throne, the Iron Queen wielded complete and unconstrained control over the Greek state. She was unconcerned with the traditional subservient role of a queen. She established her own political apparatus. She conducted direct, intense negotiations with American generals and diplomats. She made dangerous and widely publicized trips to the front lines, wearing military uniform, visiting wounded soldiers, and rallying loyal militias. She established vast and controversial welfare networks, concentrating philanthropic activities in her name. She was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly dominant. King Paul, the de facto head of state, was relegated to the sidelines during his own reign. He signed decrees presented by his wife. He delivered speeches drafted by her advisors. He maintained a calm, dignified, and deliberately bland public image. Reigned diplomats quickly realized that to achieve anything in Athens, they had to completely bypass the king and seek an audience with the queen. This relationship was so obvious that it became an open secret in diplomatic circles. Paul was merely a figurehead. He was a constitutional necessity, a man of royal blood, but power rested entirely in the hands of the German princess he was forced to marry. The complete weakening of the king's power was no accident. It was the final, successful stage of a whitewashing campaign. Frederica understood that a man as deeply broken and gentle as Paul could not survive the harsh realities of the Greek Civil War. She shielded him from the immense psychological burden of command, but in doing so, she transformed him into a highly revered ghost. He was living in utter contradiction. He was the supreme ruler of a nation, worshipped by millions of loyal citizens, yet he had less personal freedom than in his darkest days, when he wallowed in drugs in London's underground clubs. He had traded his soul for a crown, only to find that crown utterly empty. As the 1940s drew to a close, the Royalist forces, strongly supported by American firepower, and Frederica's unwavering political will, began to turn the tide of the Civil War. The Greek monarchy was gradually asserting its existence. The image of a perfect, resilient royal family spread throughout the world, a victory of conservative values over the communist revolution. King Paul stood at the center of this triumphant story. He was praised for his steadfastness and quiet dignity. He was the honored patriarch of a saved nation. But hundreds of miles away, in a dilapidated apartment in Rome, the final, agonizing chapter of his hidden truth was drawing to a violent close. The man who held the physical mirror reflecting the king's soul was breathing his last. Their vastly different destinies were about to be decided by death. It was 1948. Rome was slowly rebuilding from the devastating ruins of fascism and war. In a dark, unremarkable room, far removed from the opulent drawing rooms he had once dominated, Denny Fouts lay dying. He was only 34 years old. The man who had once been the most coveted muse of European high society was now utterly alone. His legendary beauty had been ravaged by years of heavy heroin addiction. His body was failing. Contemporary records and literary correspondence from that period foreshadowed a tragic end. He died of heart failure and complications from his severe addiction. There was no royal ceremony, no state funeral, only the quiet, tragic end of a life abandoned. At the very moment Denny breathed his last, King Paul sat firmly on his Greek throne. He was surrounded by the vast royal guard. He was sheltered by wealth, guards, and the strict rituals of politics. News of the American's death would not be published in the official palace bulletins. It would arrive through the silent, invisible channels of high society gossip. For the king, the psychological impact would undoubtedly be entirely internal and utterly devastating. He was strictly forbidden from showing any sign of grief. He could not send wreaths. He could not attend memorial services. Shedding a single tear for a foreign male prostitute would instantly destroy the clean, conservative image that had kept his dynasty afloat. Paul was forced to bury his deepest grief. He had to suppress the overwhelming pain of losing the one true love of his youth. This was the royal family's ultimate victory. They hadn't merely separated the two men physically. They had completely erased Denny Fouts from existence permitted by the king. Paul was forced to stand before a war-torn nation and demonstrate strength, morality, and orthodox family values. He had to be the image of a model father. Meanwhile, the man who held his other half was buried undignified in a foreign cemetery. The small blue tattoo on Paul's chest was no longer just a symbol of rebellion. It had become a hidden tombstone. The global political climate demanded this absolute repression. The world was rapidly freezing in the rigid duality of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were drawing absolute lines globally. Greece was the focal point of this ideological conflict in Europe. It is important to view this through a broader historical lens. Just as the Korean Peninsula would soon be violently divided by opposing ideologies, a division that modern South Korea historically considers a brutal but decisive struggle to establish a democratic republic allied with the West, Greece was fighting a desperate civil war to maintain its alliance with the West. The Truman Doctrine stipulated that the United States would support free peoples against oppression. However, this support came with absolute moral conditions. The Greek monarchy had to represent the pinnacle of conservative Christian Western civilization. Any sign of sexual deviance, drug addiction, or moral weakness would be exploited to the fullest by communist propaganda. This would jeopardize millions of dollars in American military aid. Therefore, the whitewashing of King Paul was not simply a matter of family honor. It was a matter of geopolitical survival. Queen Frederica understood this calculation perfectly. She exploited the paranoia of the Cold War to consolidate her power and complete the whitewashing of her husband's image. When the Greek Civil War ended in 1949 with a royalist victory, the 1950s ushered in a golden age of royal public relations. Frederica orchestrated a decade-long masterful campaign to elevate the Greek royal family to the absolute center of European elites. She orchestrated major state visits. She presided over lavish royal events. In 1954, she masterminded the famous Ride of the Kings, inviting over 100 members of European royalty to sail around the Greek islands on a luxurious yacht. It was a spectacular display of royal networking and soft power. It definitively demonstrated that the Greek throne was stable, glamorous, and deeply connected. Throughout this glorious decade, King Paul fulfilled his role flawlessly. He smiled gently in thousands of press photographs. He wore his naval uniform and a host of military medals with impeccable bearing. He stood proudly beside his energetic wife and 3 beautiful children. He was widely praised as a good king. He was seen as a gentle man with steady strength. The British press, always ready to support their royal relatives, frequently emphasized his quiet dignity. The image of the wandering prince was completely erased from public memory. This transformation was an absolute astonishing success. However, that perfect facade demanded an unimaginable mental strain every day. Living within such a massive lie was a slow, self-destructive inner torment. Every state banquet, every parade, every stage family portrait was a repetition of his own imprisonment. He was a man trapped in a golden cage created by his own family. He traded his honesty for the sake of royal power. He allowed his capable, domineering wife to steer the ship of state and gradually sank into resigned silence. He became a spectator in his own life. This profound inner conflict inevitably began to manifest itself outwardly. The human body often stores what is repressed within the soul. As the 1950s transitioned into the 1960s, King Paul's health began to decline slowly and steadily. He was a man who had spent his adult life suppressing the truth. He had suppressed his grief over the death of Denny Fouts. He had suppressed his own political powerlessness. He had suppressed the humiliation of being controlled by his wife. Many historians and biographers have observed that prolonged periods of intense emotional repression can severely impact physical health. For Paul, his rigid demeanor began to falter. His benevolent smile began to appear forced. In the early 1960s, darkness descended upon the Athenian court. A political atmosphere in Greece once again became profoundly unstable. Intense conflict arose between the palace, tightly controlled by the hardline Frederica, and democratically elected politicians. The public grew increasingly weary of the queen's overt political interference and her lavish, costly royal court. The impeccable facade, meticulously constructed over more than 2 decades, began to crack. King Paul was no longer the handsome, composed figure of the post-war era. He was an aging man, burdened by the invisible weight of a lifetime of deception. The secret tattoo remained etched in his skin, a silent witness to a tragedy the world would never know. As his physical health began to decline, a dark, terrifying reality loomed over the palace. Frederica's final test of her whitewashing campaign was drawing near. Not a political crisis threatening royal secrets, but the fragility of the king's finite life. A devastating medical diagnosis was about to force the Iron Queen to take her last, most desperate act of control. The dawn of the 1960s cast a harsh, uncompromising light on the meticulously constructed facade of the Greek monarchy. The post-war consensus, which had allowed Queen Frederica to operate almost without reprisal, began to crack violently. The Greek people, recovering from the wounds of occupation and civil war, were increasingly modern, educated, and deeply suspicious of the palace's overt political maneuvering. Prime Minister Konstantinos Karamanlis, a shrewd and independent conservative, clashed constantly with the hardline queen. He sought to firmly integrate Greece into the democratic framework of the expanding European economic community. Frederica, however, treated the nation as her own private domain. She demanded absolute obedience and vast unchecked budgets for her royal court. King Paul was caught in the middle of this intense constitutional conflict. He was a constitutional monarch, the one who legally sanctioned the government, yet he was completely subservient to his wife's relentless ambitions. Historical records and political memoirs from this period portray a man utterly exhausted. He frequently had to mediate bitter disputes between the prime minister and the queen. He bore the brunt of the contradictions. He swallowed the humiliation of becoming insignificant. It was an immense psychological burden to spend decades merely serving as a scapegoat for others' ambitions. For Paul, the internal damage was devastating. The constant suppression of his own desires, pain, and political voice created a silent, toxic pressure that began to physically drain him. By the end of 1963, the undeniable signs of his severe physical decline could no longer be concealed by tailored suits or royal portraits. King Paul was rapidly losing weight. His complexion, once a testament to the robust health of a monarch, had turned a sickly grayish blue. The man who had spent his youth wandering the vibrant, chaotic streets of Europe with Denny Fouts now struggled to stand upright during the endless royal ceremonies. Behind the impenetrable walls of Tatoy Palace, the royal physicians were summoned in absolute secrecy. Medical examinations were conducted with fearful urgency. The diagnosis they delivered was a death sentence. King Paul was suffering from terminal aggressive stomach cancer. This medical reality presented Queen Frederica with the most terrifying crisis of her entire reign. A dying monarch is a vulnerable one. Throughout his life, Paul's body had been the canvas on which Frederica painted her propaganda masterpieces for her dynasty, but cancer could not be subdued by a royal decree. The disease was stripping him of the dignity he had so painstakingly cultivated, plunging him into painful dependence and helplessness. More importantly, the drastic medical intervention needed to treat the king threatened to expose the most dangerous secret of his life. Imagine the logistical nightmare the Iron Queen faced. Every time a surgeon, an X-ray technician, or a nurse approached the king's bedside, they had to strip him of his clothes. They had to expose his chest, and there, lying silently on his failing heart, was the undeniable evidence of his past. A small blue tattoo, a perpetual pact made with an American prostitute during a drug-induced stupor, was suddenly scrutinized under a cold, scientific light. Some royal historians suggest Frederica was forced to ruthlessly screen the medical staff, selecting only the most loyal aristocratic doctors, those who could swear absolute silence. She transformed the medical ward at Tatoy Palace into an impenetrable fortress, not only to fight cancer, but also to fiercely protect her lies. The psychological atmosphere in the king's sick room must have been stifling. Paul was a man facing the abyss of his own finitude. It is a universal human truth that, as death approaches, the mind powerfully strips away the superficial layers of life, returning to the painful clarity of the deepest and most genuine emotional moments. For the Greek king, surrounded by the cold, sterile equipment of modern medicine and the terrifying, watchful eye of his wife, those memories did not belong to the throne. They did not belong to solemn state visits or cheering crowds. They belonged to Denny Fouts. It was a terrible contradiction. The monarch, revered by millions as the patriarch of a conservative Orthodox Christian nation, was dying with a heart broken decades earlier by a life of exile, forgotten and disgraced. The physical pain of stomach cancer could only be compared to the agonizing resurgence of a repressed youth. He was forced to silently reconcile the vast, insurmountable chasm between the man he was born and the man he had allowed himself to become. The wandering prince had finally run out of time. As 1964 began, the global geopolitical landscape was incredibly unstable. The assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy the previous November had sent shockwaves through the Western alliance. The Cold War had escalated significantly. Greece, holding NATO's crucial southeastern flank, could not afford a power vacuum. Rulers, both in Athens and London, watched the king's declining health with growing anxiety. A smooth, unblemished transfer of power to his young, inexperienced son, Crown Prince Constantine, was considered paramount to national security. No talk of scandal was allowed. No crack in the royal family's moral standing was permitted. Frederica understood this perfectly. She orchestrated Paul's final months with chilling precision and dramatic flair. When the king underwent major surgery in February 1964, the palace released meticulously edited and misleading press releases. They spoke of treatment for minor ulcers. They broadcast photographs of the king sitting in his chair, leaning back, looking sickly, but still smiling devotedly. It was a macabre performance, a desperate attempt to maintain continuity while he himself was being ravaged by illness. The queen never left his side. She was his caretaker, his gatekeeper, and his final confinement. She ensured that no unauthorized guest, no unauthorized clergyman, and no independent journalist could get close enough to witness the horrific reality of his decline. In the painful final days of late February and early March, King Paul drifted in and out of consciousness. The grand narrative of his reign, the intricate alliances of European monarchies, the fierce political struggles with his prime ministers, all became utterly meaningless. He was left with only his core essence. He was a man who had loved intensely, who had suffered profound loss, and who had spent his entire life paying the price for a moment of forbidden truth. The young American had shown him absolute freedom, long dead, buried in a lonely Roman tomb. Paul was now following in his footsteps into the shadows, but he did so while weighed down by the unbearable, suffocating weight of a crown he had never truly wanted to wear. The ultimate tragedy in King Paul's final hours was defined by his utter isolation. He was surrounded by the most powerful people, yet never had he felt so alone. He could not confess his true regrets. He could not utter the name of the only person who had ever truly seen him. He was forced to maintain the discipline of the court until his last breath. The queen stood guard as a guardian of the dynasty's survival, ensuring that the wandering prince would die in absolute terrifying silence, carrying the secret of the blue tattoo into eternal darkness. The final act was drawing to a close, and the ultimate act of erasing history was perfectly prepared. The end came on the afternoon of March 6, 1964. Inside the heavily guarded walls of the Tatoi Palace, the suffocating tension that had gripped the royal family finally broke. King Paul I of Greece breathed his last, a labored death. He was 62 years old. His body, ravaged by stomach cancer and exhausted by decades of relentless psychological repression, gave way. At the very moment of his death, the room was not filled with the chaotic grief of an ordinary family losing its head of state. It was filled with the terrifying, calculated silence of a dynasty poised to ensure its survival. Queen Frederica, standing by the bedside, did not succumb to hysteria. She had accurately predicted this moment for months. Her grief was instantly transformed into a weapon of absolute tactical control. Normally, after the death of a king or queen, state ceremonies are meticulously planned. But for Frederica, there was an invisible ritual, far more important, that needed to be performed before the state machinery could function. The king's body was now a grave burden. The moment his breath left his lungs, he was no longer a ruler, but a physical testament. The room was thoroughly cleared. No unnecessary people remained. Only a select few doctors and extremely loyal assistants stayed. Frederica understood that at the greatest threat to her legacy and to the immediate succession of her son Constantine lay motionless on her late husband's chest a small blue tattoo, an eternal, undeniable mark of his forbidden youth with Denny Fouts. While alive, Paul could conceal it beneath layers of tailored sweaters and a dignified office posture. But in death, he was utterly defenseless against the scrutinizing, cold gaze of the funeral staff and state officials. The process of preparing a royal body for a state funeral was highly intrusive of privacy. It required washing, embalming, and dressing by numerous people. Any murmur of a boisterous, rebellious tattoo on the heart of the king, especially one rumored to be connected to a notorious American male prostitute, would immediately cause a catastrophic scandal. The communist opposition would seize it. The conservative Orthodox Church would be horrified. British and American allies would view the Greek throne with deep suspicion. The 26-year-long whitewashing campaign is in danger of collapsing completely. Frederica controlled the physical environment ruthlessly and effectively. Historical records of royal rites show that the preparation of the king's body was a closely supervised affair, but Frederica took this to an absolute paranoia. She personally oversaw the burial process. She gave clear, uncompromising instructions to her trusted medical team. The king's upper body had to be handled with utmost discretion. The skin over his heart was not to be examined, discussed, or documented. It had to be covered quickly and permanently. This was the Iron Queen's final decisive act. She not only managed his life, she also censored his body forcefully. She ensured that the last physical trace of his true self, the only eternal monument to his capacity for genuine love, was brutally erased from history. The choice of funeral attire was the final blow to this masterpiece of deception. King Paul was not buried in the simple, modest CL, others of an ordinary man. He was dressed in the heavy, elaborate uniform of the commander-in-chief of the Greek armed forces. Every button was fastened. Every ribbon was perfectly arranged. And then came the medals. Dozens of heavy metal medals, symbolizing a lifetime of devoted service, were arranged and pinned directly to his chest. They formed a physical shield, literally, of state-approved glory, precisely concealing the blue tattoo. The heavy brass and gleaming enamel weighed down the truth. The prodigal prince was buried under the crushing weight of his own fabricated legacy. After the body was safely preserved and the secrecy successfully neutralized, Frederica finally allowed the government machinery to operate. The palace issued a statement. National radio stations paused their broadcasts with solemn, mournful music. The Greek people were informed that their steadfast, benevolent king had died. This reaction was precisely what Frederica had orchestrated. There was widespread, genuine grief among the public. People mourned a man they believed had led them through the horrors of the Civil War and the perilous early years of the Cold War. They mourned a devoted husband and a perfectly orthodox patriarchal father. They mourned an illusion. They were completely unaware that the man they were mourning had spent his entire life emotionally bound to a deceased, drug-addicted American woman. The succession proceeded swiftly and desperately. Just hours after Paul's death, his 23-year-old son hastily swore himself on the throne as Constantine II. The young, untested king, heavily dependent on his autocratic mother, inherited a deeply divided nation and a throne built on a foundation of absolute lies. Frederica immediately transitioned from empress to empress dowager, maintaining absolute power behind the young king. She successfully navigated the most dangerous hurdle in maintaining the dynasty. The royal bloodline was secured. The secret was buried. All that remained was the elaborate funeral charade. The state funeral of March 12, 1964, was a masterpiece of European grandeur. It demonstrated absolute stability. Beneath the heavy, elaborate military uniform and the overwhelming weight of the state ceremony, the king's hidden truth was safely buried. Frederica had won. She had succeeded in arranging his departure, ensuring his reactionary past remained buried. However, institutions built on lies rarely withstand the impact of reality. The rigid conservative regime that Frederica had established quickly alienated a rapidly modernizing Greek society. By 1967, the hollow royal apparatus had completely collapsed under a military coup. King Constantine II, unable to cope with this harsh reality, was forced to flee with his family in the dead of night. In a cruel geographical irony, the exiled members of the royal family found refuge in Rome. They wandered the very streets where Denny Fouts had breathed his last in agony 2 decades earlier. The crown that King Paul had bought with all his heart was gone. It had been officially abolished by the Greek people in 1974. All the ruthless geopolitical maneuvering of the Iron Queen had ultimately become fading memories. Today, beneath the gradually encroaching pines of the decaying Tatoi cemetery, King Paul lies in eternal silence. History has slowly revealed the whispers of his youth. It portrays the good king not as a perfect patriarch, but as a tragic victim of a cruel machine. If the rumors of the small blue tattoo are true, it remains the only relic of a prince who dared to love beyond the limits of fate. It stands there as an eternal eulogy, concealing the terrible price of an empty crown.